detailed approach to the idea that life can come from non-life. That's what we're going to address now. So one of the things about evolution, you might have seen that in Lynn Margulis's definition I gave you earlier, that life is presented as a fact, and if you don't believe in evolution, you're absolutely ignorant. I won't go into my educational background, but I have an extensive educational background, but they would consider me ignorant because I reject evolution. So here's an example that was in Scientific American. We now know evolution to be a simple fact, and it's been fully confirmed. So this was written in 2000, 24 years ago. Well, is this really the case? Remember the definition. Everything is coming from a single protocell. Genetic information is increasing through time. All of the species of plants and animals have much more, well, not all, some of the bacteria might not, but all the plants and animals certainly have more genetic information than in that original cell. Some have died off, whether in the fossil record or in other times, and there are the missing links. This is Lynn Margulis's definition. Remember, every form of life on Earth, oak tree and elephant, bird and bacterium, shares a common ancestry. And we're going to see some examples of why this supposed common ancestry is important, because it deals with a subject called convergence, which is a challenge for evolutionists. Again, what difference does it make? Why do we care? Well, when we look at this, the Bible tells us that plants and animals were created by their kinds. And so, not from pre-existing materials. Of course, I mentioned earlier that there were a few examples from pre-existing material, like Adam from the dirt and Eve from a rib. But God tells us that. The point is that we either say if what God said in Genesis 1 is accurate, or it's not. It really comes down to that decision. We also know that mankind was created a unique creation on the sixth day, not evolved from an ape-like creature. And again, you either have to be yes or no on this kind of question. Because if evolution is true, then Genesis 1 is merely a myth. This is why we need to get this right. Also, in Solomon's writings, he says it is a privilege for kings to spend time to learn, to know. And I was mentioning to somebody, I taught statistics at university for 10 years. And one of the things I tried to reinforce with these students is that we live in a culture where they can actually spend time learning and get a privilege of doing it. It's an honor, in a sense, that in Solomon's day, the only people that could afford to do study were rich people. And yet, it's much better. So we have an opportunity to learn, and we should be willing to learn the truth. Simon, you said you have a reading program every 2 years? You read through the Bible?
Through the Bible in 2 years.
Yeah.
We encourage people to do
Yeah.
that.
So this is good because we need to be learning our Bible, don't we? Yeah. And I want to show you a little more detail of pre-biological evolution to the challenges with evolution, because the real reason that people don't accept biblical creation is they don't want to believe in a creator, because the moment they believe in a creator, they're suddenly accountable to him as the lawgiver. That's the situation that we're dealing with. So there have been attempts to synthesize life. In fact, there was a project called Cynthia, but spelled with an S, that ran for 10 years, and they invested millions of dollars in this program. And a massive amount of intelligence was applied to try to synthesize life from chemicals. Notice what this says. Scientists are still waiting for proof that chemical ingredients can spontaneously assemble themselves, become wrapped in a membrane, and divide. In other words, there's still a missing link between the chemistry of early life and its subsequent biology. That wasn't in a Christian publication. That was in Popular Mechanics. And Cynthia failed to generate life from chemical materials. The best they could do is take genetic information from one bacteria and move it to another. That's essentially the best they were able to accomplish. Here's another example. One of science's most enduring mysteries, namely how life sprang from non-living matter. They admit that there's a problem here. I mentioned at lunch to someone that this book, we carry it. I don't have it in my home inventory, but I highly recommend it. I've read it twice flying out west. Good reading time on planes. And it's written by two people that have the right skills to do it. One a PhD in biochemistry and the other in medical engineering. And it's called The Stairway to Life. And they go through 12 steps of pre-biological chemistry. And it's written basically for a lay audience. There's nothing in it that would, I don't even know if they're Christians. There's nothing in it that is objectionable to a Christian or that is pushing Christianity. They just deal with the science, and it's written basically for a lay audience. And this is in a comment about the book. From recently acquired insights into the complexity of the simplest organisms, Tan and Stadler specify requirements for spontaneous formation of life and evaluate the prospects for natural processes to satisfy these requirements. And the conclusion is it's impossible. Impossible for chemistry to produce life. If you want something that just destroys the idea of what's called abiogenesis, life coming spontaneously, read this book. And it's not that difficult to understand. It isn't difficult. You have to be intelligent, but not a scientist to understand it. So it's impossible that the genetic code arose by chance. And simply evolutionists have no explanation for how that occurred. I quoted to you two examples. There was an organization called the Origin of Life Science Foundation, and it offered $1 million prize to, what they say, anyone proposing a highly plausible natural process mechanism for the spontaneous rise of genetic instructions in nature sufficient to give rise to life. Do you think they ever paid out the $1 million? No, they didn't. Who wouldn't try to get $1 million? It's like the illustration I used this morning. Prove to me your phone or a tablet wrote its own software, and I'll give you $1 million. It's not going to happen. They were hoping that somebody would actually demonstrate it. So the idea that chance can spontaneously generate living entities is pure imagination. When we deal with the complexity of DNA, do you know that DNA can be read in both directions? You try to write a meaningful sentence that can be read in both directions. Try it. Can you think of a word that can be read in both directions? Race car. You can read in both directions. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. They're called palindromes. Now, these are identical in both directions. Those are even harder to write. But here's an example, and it may sound risque as I started, but once you get the context, and if you know Genesis chapter 2, you'll understand it. So there was the most beautiful woman you can imagine, and she's stark naked, and she's going to toward this young man. And he goes up to her and he says, "Madam, I'm Adam." It can be read in both directions. Of course, you know, in Genesis chapter 2 and 3, they were naked because they hadn't sinned yet. Remember that? So, and Adam was asleep when he was created, so he had to introduce himself to her. "Madam, I'm Adam." Another one I like is, you'll have to tell me who this was. I know who it was, but see if you know. "Able was I ere I saw Elba." When Napoleon went into exile. So these are palindromes. DNA, depending on which direction you're reading it and which genes you're dealing with. In fact, you've probably heard of these things. Remember during the COVID period, you heard a lot about these things called mRNA, messenger RNA, and these vaccines that carried mRNA. So when the double helix opens up, it's like a zipper, and a little factory machine goes up the little zipper, and it actually zips out a molecule that it's creating, and it's called mRNA. It's generating it. The mRNA strand, when it's ready, means messenger RNA, is then transported inside the cell over to another facility that processes it and creates a protein. That's how proteins are made from the genes. And so, depending on where you open up the DNA and which direction you go, you get different proteins generated. And you can generate different kinds of proteins from the same genes. So between the genes, and there's about 25,000 of them in the human genetics, between them, they used to call it junk DNA. Now they realize that there's massive quantities of programming information in the gaps between the genes in the DNA. I'll give you an example of the intelligence that's encoded in the programming in DNA. If a woman conceives at a very high altitude, let's say at the top of the Andes or at the top of the Himalayas, the developing baby, somehow the genetics in there sense the atmospheric pressure, and that child is going to be born with a significantly extra large lung capacity. That is built into the DNA, to that programming. It's absolutely astounding what we have discovered about what DNA has in it. Scientists look at it. I mentioned that it's made up of 4 nucleotides. In computers, we use 2, zeros and ones. In DNA, there's 4. And when they look at the density of information that can be stored in DNA, it is absolutely astounding what you can code with those 4 letters. And it blows away in terms of information density, data sticks that you can put like terabytes on, what you can put inside of a tiny little nucleus in the DNA is astounding when you look at what's going on in there. Now, I mentioned this machine earlier, so we'll skip that for now. Behe wrote a book about 25 years ago, actually 1996, so it's longer than that ago, almost 30 years ago, wow, called Darwin's Black Box. Now, I must make a comment here. Behe is what's called, he's in the area of intelligent design. We use some of that material, but many of the people in intelligent design who are proponents don't go to the next step and declare that the intelligent designer is the God of the Bible. It's some sort of nebulous intelligent designer, but they are trying to keep a credibility with secular thinking, so they won't come right out and say it's Genesis chapter 1 God, right? They won't say that. Now Behe, well, I'll mention in a moment. He says here, in his book, Darwin's Black Box, if you search the scientific literature on evolution, you focus your search on the question of how molecular machines, the basis of life, develop, you find an eerie and complete silence. The complexity of life's foundation has paralyzed science's attempt to account for it. That was written in 1996. He came out a few years ago with Darwin Devolves. And in it, he indicates that the problem has even gotten worse. And he gives more examples. Now, I wrote a review on this, and it was published in the Creation Science Quarterly, not our publication, the Creation Science Institute Quarterly. And I pointed out that, sadly, in this book, he's basically a theistic evolutionist and believes in deep time. But when it comes to the molecular machines, he's right on. And he is indicating that down at the molecular level, there is no way that this can come into existence by chance. I mentioned already these, so I'll go through them quickly. How did cells get a nucleus? And then you bring it up a level. Oh, let me just back up there. You notice the 482 genes is more complex than the information that it would take to specify the manufacturing of an automobile. If you were to print out the specs to manufacture an automobile, the amount of information in 482 genes is far more. And this is supposed to have arisen by chance. I mentioned the origin of multicellular life, and then origin of sexual reproduction. So let's go beyond that. Here are some other challenges. The concept of what is called convergence. How did flight evolve in all these different parts of the tree of life, as they would call it? And you have to make an incredible leap to think that these creatures, multiple different ones that are not descended from one another in their model, could have developed flight. Or here, do you know that octopuses and squids have eyes that are very similar to humans, and yet a supposed common ancestor for both of them doesn't? Like, how do you see this? Well, from our standpoint, an intelligent designer would reuse these components. Hemoglobin is a very complex module, and even some plants have hemoglobin in them. Now, how did such a complex molecule develop by chance? Again, a designer would use it in plants and in animals, but if we had a common ancestor, everything that comes up to that should all have hemoglobin in it. But it doesn't. It's in different places. Here's another example of convergence. This particular molecule is found in golden dead nettle and zebra plants and in some grasses, but it doesn't come from their common ancestor. It is multiply, supposedly, coming into existence. If you read Behe's book, and I not necessarily recommend you spend money on it, but if you were, you will see that he deals with this kind of molecule and says, how does this come into existence by chance? Take it up a level, and we have not only convergence as a challenge, but it's called species stasis, that kind gives like to kind. And notice this article, and it was called "Was Darwin Wrong?" And he's saying that fruit flies refuse to become anything other than fruit flies, no matter what you do in their environments. Yes, you can mutate them with radiation and they'll lose their wings, or they'll grow an extra set of antennae and all kinds of things, but they never become anything other than fruit flies, or Drosophilus madagascar. After 3,000 years of extreme selective breeding, has a dog become anything other than a dog? Selective, forced breeding, and yet natural selection is supposed to have created in a few generations, comparatively, all of the life we see around us. Here's another example of species stasis in, was this in a flea? And what they said is that there were changes, but they eventually canceled out one another through time. It always reverted to a mean. And it's interesting that they claim to be demonstrating evolution, but it's not. Their article is actually demonstrating exactly the opposite. Another area where there's a problem, I mentioned symbiotic relationships, and I gave you the example of the bee. This Tasmanian snow skink is necessary for the honeybush to be pollinated. It has a very hard shell around its flowers, and the Tasmanian snow skink has to go and break open the shell in order for the plant to be pollinated. Notice what The Economist said about this. Why did the honeybush evolve such a complicated procedure for its pollination? Do you notice anything in this? It's attributing thinking, rationality, and causation to the honeybush. Like it's saying, oh, I need to be pollinated. What am I going to do? I need to work with a skink to make this happen. The very way it's worded is silly. Another issue with chance-based processes comes down to morality. If you were, when I was in university, I worked in the science center for all 4 of my years, and I got to take all these fancy science courses 4 times, but I didn't have to write the exams because I set up all their lectures and their slides and videotaped them and all their experiments. It was great. But one of the courses I took was on sociobiology. And how do you explain behaviors like bees and ants cooperating, just as an example? But according to evolutionists, everything is explainable by our genes. But if it explains too much, any deviance of behavior then is a result of our genes. For example, here, Science Daily, human prejudice has ancient evolutionary roots. So if you are prejudicial against your neighbor, you blame it on your genes. Interesting enough, we are very insistent that there is only one human race. We avoid using the term race. It was Darwin who introduced the concept of race in a later book called The Devolution of Man is blatantly racist. And I don't know why they're not tearing down Darwin's statues these days. Where did the phenotypic differences come from? First, it started linguistic. At the Tower of Babel, God separated people into small breeding populations because only a few would know the language and they were being scattered around. And then there would be some degree of inbreeding, and over time their physical characteristics would start to differ. And if that group over there looks different than me and doesn't speak like I do, then I'm going to be prejudiced against them. That's where prejudice arose from. It is a direct result of the Tower of Babel. Now, there's a book called The Natural History of Rape, the biological basis for sexual coercion. It actually justifies rape because of our genes. This is the result of believing in evolution. Morality, remember that pillar I put up at the beginning? Morality is meaningless if your foundation is evolution, because everything is natural. So it's when you're dealing with evolution, basically, what is the causal factor? So they basically will tell you that there are 4 things. Natural selection and mutations are the primary ones, but there's also random drift and gene flow. We're not going to look at this because neither of these introduces new information, not supposed. So we're only going to look at natural selection and mutation. That's what we're going to consider as what's supposedly driving evolution. So do these 2 things actually support evolution? So let's look first at natural selection. Now, I prefer to use the term adaptive selection. The genes have the ability to adapt to different environmental circumstances. So let's assume that we have some original canine kind that had the genes for both long and short fur lengths. We were talking, about, you use the letter Z or Z, right? Huh?
Whatever group of letters, if one's not in it, you can't add.
You can't add another letter. So we have here an alphabet that includes all 26 letters right at the moment, right? Now, this couple have both long and short. 1 gene for long and 1 gene for short. So their offspring is going to have a mix. Some will have only long, and some will only have short, and some will have both. But what will happen is, if they're in a very cool climate, the ones that have only the gene for the long will be more adaptive, and over time, the short will disappear. The gene for the short will disappear. You can think of a white fox. You won't get a black or brown fox from a white fox. It's lost its gene for brown. But you can breed them, and you'll bring the 2 genes back together. And you might get, I don't know, a purple fox or something, right? I'm inventing that. So what happens is you lose genetic information through adaptive selection. And the more specialized you become over time, the genetic information is deteriorating and you're not adding new information. Natural selection removes information, it doesn't add information. So that small breeding population lost its genetic information. And this is exactly the opposite of the definition of evolution, which is increasing, adding information through time. And these long-furred canines are going to be less adaptable than their original forebears, because if they ended up in a very hot climate, too much fur, and they'd be uncomfortable. And somebody'd have to keep shaving their fur off, or they'll be very uncomfortable. So originally there was a wide spectrum of genetic information in the kinds that when they came out of the ark. And so 2 of the equine kind came out. That broad spectrum of genetic information is there. By the time they had differentiated in small breeding populations, say into donkey and horses, what happens when you breed a donkey and a horse? What do you get? A mule if you breed one way, and a hinny if you breed the other way. Are mules or hinnies fertile? No, because they've lost too much genetic information. But nevertheless, they can still breed because they came from the original equine kind. Similarly, you cannot breed a domestic cat with a lion or a tiger. In fact, they've lost whole chromosomes of information in a domestic cat is different than what's in a lion or a tiger. But you can breed a tiger and a lion. So over time, information is being lost. And this is what we'd expect because there's decay. So according to the evolutionists, now I've flipped the tree upside down here, but at time, there's increasing genetic information in the evolutionary models. In contrast, the biblical base model is God created the kinds, and there was mass extinctions during the Ice Age. I'm talking about post-flood here, the kinds that came out of the ark. Mass extinctions of various in the Ice Age, and then we have all the modern species. But each of those modern species has a subset of the original kind's genetic information. So we're actually getting a decrease in speciation, not an increase. Natural selection actually, or adaptive selection, actually reduces the amount of genetic information. It doesn't add any new information. And so this is, the evolutionary model is wrong. There is no increasing genetic information through time. Here's an example where you bring people that have broader spectrum of the genetics together, and both of these twins have characteristics that are from both parents. One of my daughters-in-law is Chinese, and Charles, I tell them that Charles has brought together 2 really strong genes, because you bring 2 very disparate sets of genetics together. Charles is going to be very healthy. Not only that, he's the smartest grandkid on the face of the earth. So here's examples of twins which are from one birth. Now they're not identical twins, obviously, but this, and look at it, somebody worked for years to try to breed or to get a Labrador that could breed all of the, or give birth to all of the colors of Labradors. It's quite a challenge to get them all coming from one birth. So you get the chocolate and the golden and the black from one birth. It's kind of cool. But the genetic information's there, but if you only breed golden labs, you're only going to get golden labs after time. But it took a lot of work to breed that bird. Now what happened is the coming out of the ark, the species and the humans spread around the world, and they became isolated into pockets of populations, not only human populations that didn't breed with others because of prejudices, but also in animals they didn't breed, and so genetic information was being lost among the animals. Humans actually did continue to interbreed across populations because of slavery. They captured people, and I'm talking long before transatlantic slavery. Slavery's been around right from the beginning, basically, but they would breed with slaves. They would take captives in war and so on. So the human population didn't fully separate into species that could not breed, but animals did. Here's a problem, say, when you are highly specialized. This article was describing how the Camembert and Brie cheeses are facing extinction because it's all based on a single fungus, and the fungus is decaying, and we're not going to have, I'm not a favorite, these are not my favorite cheeses, but we're not going to have these cheeses anymore because the fungus is decaying. It's losing its strength. This, here it was written in New Zealand Herald, overly drastic selection, the genetic diversity has been greatly reduced. That's what's happening when you highly specialize. Salmon have a huge variety of them. Some of them can live only in salt water, some only in fresh water, and some can do both, for example. But they cannot evolve into anything other than salmon. They can't go outside of their genetic spectrum. And so the evolutionists will claim that beneficial mutations are the mechanisms that take you beyond the amount of information in the original kind. So we're going to look at mutations in a second. But here, with an antibiotic, and this is from the University of California, Berkeley website. And this is describing evolution. So notice in the first picture, there is an antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the mix. Okay? It's there. And then they inject an antibiotic into it, and they kill off all the good bacteria until only the antibiotic-resistant ones are left. And yet they call this evolution. This isn't evolution. It's just killing off one species of bacteria, not another, or one subset of it. You've heard of what's the doctors and nurses are really afraid of the infection that might hit hospitals because of antibiotic. That's one of them, yes, but there's another one. Anyway, it causes bad dysentery and various things. But that bacteria is probably in every one of our guts. It's just that the good bacteria controls it. And when you take an antibiotic, it kills all the good bacteria, and then the bad bacteria explodes. That's what's happening. So selecting an existing variant isn't evolution. Here's a study that was done at Michigan State University, and they were working with E. coli, and they have, at the time I read the article, they had already put it through 67,000 generations of E. coli, right, in their petri dishes. They would try various things, injecting antibiotics, temperature, radiation, and so on. They would see the same mutations occurring. But after 60,000 generations, that thing never became anything other than an E. coli bacteria. So 67,000 generations. Okay, let's take 1.2 million years, and we're supposed to have evolved from an ape-like creature to a human. We might get what? Maybe 1,000 generations? Not 67,000 generations, and yet we're supposed to get all of these additions and changes, and you can't chew anything to a bacteria to make it other than E. coli? So antibiotic-resistant bacteria are still bacteria, and interestingly enough, the antibiotic bacteria and resistant bacteria existed even before the antibiotics came along. They discovered the bodies of the members of the Franklin expedition. The ship was frozen in our Arctic and had been lost for many years. And when they examined their guts, they found the antibiotic resistance. So they were like 50 or more years before antibiotics came along. Isolated tribes in South America, never seen a vaccine in their life, yet have that resistant bacteria in them. Stool samples taken from soldiers that were killed during the they died of dysentery during the First World War, and they took stool samples, and they looked at the bacteria in the frozen stool samples, and they found antibiotic resistant there. It's always been there. It's a variant. So it wasn't evolution, it was part of the genetic variety in bacteria. So natural selection does not produce new information. It is not the cause of increasing information. It just isn't. It is devolution. Reducing information is how species come about. Let's look at then mutations. That's other suggestions. Mutations are mostly information loss. I gave you an example with the T of the ability to produce enzyme, caffeine synthase. So, now there is some gene insertion and some rearrangement. I mentioned that those are possible, but that's not new information. It's just grabbing it from somewhere else. Did you know that the yellow cardinal is a red cardinal that has a mutation and it can't produce the color red? It's kind of a pretty bird though, isn't it? But it's a mutation. I see these all over our backyard. This is a mutant of a gray squirrel. It has lost the ability to produce the the gray pigment, and it's reverted. It's a mutant in this thing. Faulty pigment. Notice all these. It's an error. It's a defect. It's a problem. Here's what often happens with mutations. They cause all kinds of defects. Diseases, deformities, deterioration. So, are all mutations harmful? So, a claim is that some might be beneficial. Go to nature.com and read their article about mutations. You can see it. It's an extremely long article. Somebody needs to learn how to set up web pages, but putting that aside, they don't mention a single beneficial mutation on the entire site. And at the very bottom, the very last words of it, this is what it says. Together, these different classes of mutations and their causes serve to place organisms at risk, right? A bad mutation probably is going to kill you. That's at risk for disease, and then it says to provide the raw material for evolution. Thus, mutations are detrimental to the individual, but they serve to diversify the overall population. Not a shred of evidence. This is just thrown out at the very end. Even though all these mutations are bad, they kill individuals. Nevertheless, it's good because it creates diversity. No new information, loss of information. The only one that evolutionists ever bring forward as a potential positive is sickle cell anemia. Now, on that Nature website, they do not call sickle cell anemia a positive mutation. I checked to make sure. But it does confer some degree of protection against malaria, but at a very high cost, because 25% of children that are carriers of sickle cell anemia can't get enough oxygen in their blood, and they end up dying early. So if this is a good mutation, it's weird because it's impeding oxygen distribution in the body. Remember when coronavirus hit? I wrote a letter to our prime geneticist, Robert Carter, and I said, how long is this going to be a problem? He said 2 years, because every virus mutates and deteriorates through time, and they have about a 2-year life expectancy. Now, you can still get an infection from coronavirus, but it's far less of a problem than it was when it first hit late 2019. And notice this article here. The coronavirus is mutating, but that's not a bad thing. And the reason is because the bulk of the mutations appear as a virus spreads are either harmful to the virus or less or benign. So over time, now new viruses are coming on stream, and they're a problem, just like new variants of flu come every year, and we have to watch for them. But the coronavirus is deteriorating, and it will become just a minor irritant, like getting a cold. So there's this contradiction with evolutionists. On the one hand, they say mutations produce new information and are good, but notice things like genetically modified foods. They don't want you to be taking genetic humans because they're worried about the impacts. Let's look at an example here. The results to date have been reassuring. Genetically altered organisms have proved to be less viable. If you breed a hybrid corn, it's not as viable as the original corn that you brought the two strands together to bring a hybrid, and it won't grow true. My wife is from Puerto Rico, and she gets these very hot pepper seeds, and she grows them in. And last year, I picked a lot, and I had to use those disposable gloves, but you get that on you, and boy, it burns. So I decided to make a hot sauce out of it. I have to tell you this because you're going to chuckle out my stupidity, but I'm putting these in the pot and cooking them up, and I'm looking at a recipe I got on the line. It said put in a clove of garlic. So I didn't know what a clove of garlic was. And so I got one of the entire bulbs, and I was going to put it in. And Lillian says, no, that's way too much garlic. It meant one of the little pieces. So anyway, I grind up and put it in and cook it up. And then two of my boys, and they're both outstanding chefs, not me, and they said, Dad, did you really make this hot sauce? They couldn't believe that I'd actually made it. So she saved some of the seeds for this year and grew them. Nothing hot. I've been eating them just like normal peppers. They've deteriorated because they were hybrid seeds. And so you have to breed them specially if you're going to get this particular brand of hot pepper. So they deteriorate through time. So if we have human-directed change is actually less viable, then under what conditions would random change make something more viable? Just think of the logic here. H. pylori. I don't know if you know the story about this, but people used to say that ulcers were caused by stress. You remember that? There was a scientist who believed that they were caused by bacteria, H. pylori. Nobody would believe him. It's one of these Copernican revolution type of things. So you know what he did? He infected himself, then took an antibiotic, and killed the H. pylori to demonstrate that the ulcers, that's pretty dangerous doing that at your test on yourself, but that's what he did. But H. pylori, mutation, antibiotic resistant, is a loss of the ability to produce an enzyme. It is loss of information. Tuberculosis mutation is overproduction that weakens the bacteria overall. Loss of information. UC, University of California Riverside, growing these mosquitoes that they want to put out. Not sure this is the wisest thing to be doing, but these specially grown mosquitoes are less fertile, less healthy than the natural ones. So where are we going to get positive mutations that can drive the supposed evolution? Genes don't suddenly pop into existence, and where do they come from? Where is this additional information coming from? They can't explain it. And so I would argue that some mutations may be benign, but most are detrimental. Look at this recently. 2022, most silent genetic mutations are harmful, not neutral. A finding with broad implications. You're not kidding. This destroys evolution because you have no mechanism for supposedly creating new information, which they never did. So to go from microbes to man in evolution, to basically we're talking the biblical kinds more or less correspond to the family, not precisely definition. But you can interbreed within a family. I don't know if you knew, but llamas and camels can interbreed. Now, they've been separated for quite a long time because llamas are in South America and camels are in Middle East and Asia, but they can interbreed. So I don't know if they're fertile, but they can interbreed. But they had lost genetic information. But there's a limit. You're bringing back some of the information that was in the original kind. There's a limit of information available, and when you take a subset of the information, you can get breeds of dogs, for example. But notice what this one article says. Viruses aren't infinitely mutable. Even the most careful dog breeders cannot turn a bulldog into a bear. You can't. If the alphabet doesn't have the letter Z, you'll never spell a, right? You'll never, it's not there. The information's gone. So nobody has ever demonstrated that you can get with outside of a family level, actually go further, because there's no genetic information there at all. So what evidence exists for evolution based on this? That's how much. Zero. None exists. There is nothing that supports the claim that mutations will produce new information and then natural selection will select them. Evolution is a theory universally accepted, not because it can be proven by logically coherent evidence to be true, but because the only alternative, special creation, is clearly incredible. That was written in Nature magazine, not a Christian publication. And it's a theory without a foundation. It's not scientific, and it is in crisis. Here, because men are suppressing truth, here is from the introduction to an edition of Darwin's book on the origin of species. Most biologists accept evolution, as though it were a proven fact, although this conviction rests upon circumstantial evidence. It forms a satisfactory faith on which to base our interpretation of nature. Evolution is believed because they don't want the alternative. Here, it was published in the New York Review, and he says, we will accept evolution because we do not want a defined foot in the door. So I've already talked to you about these books. This Genetic Entropy is a good one. I had one copy. I don't know if it's been sold. Creatures do change, but it's not an evolution. I've got some copies of those. So, evolution is in real deep trouble, believe me. But the popular media won't let you know that. So, we can entertain some questions. You're going to have to speak loudly because I have trouble hearing. I wear hearing aids in both ears, and so it's very difficult sometimes. Any questions? You have a question, don't you? Oh, yeah, you look back. I was looking right.
Oh,
no,
thank you.
I'm teasing you. Okay. Any questions? Yes, sir.
So, you just happened to mention Ice Age.
Yes.
So, where does the Ice Age
Fit in the big picture?
Yeah, fit into the big picture.
Okay. So the Ice Age started the very first winter after the flood. Okay? So why? Because the oceans were uniformly very warm, because there are a lot of mixing during the flood, and 25,000 odd volcanoes have exploded up all this hot vapor into the atmosphere. So the oceans were uniformly warm. The atmosphere was polluted by a lot of dust, and so sunlight wasn't getting through. The dust came from the volcano. In 1814, one major volcano exploded called Tambora. But anyway, next summer, in 1815, crops in New England failed, and in the Maritimes, and there was frost in July. One volcano, the amount of dust. Can you imagine 25,000? So you have these two conditions, which are less heat coming through in the atmosphere and cold cool summers and hot oceans. What happens when cold winter air goes across a warm body of water? Massive amounts of snow. When Lake Erie is warm, what happens in Buffalo? Massive quantities of snow dump on it, right? So all of that snow pumping off of the Pacific and off of the Atlantic, hitting North America, hitting Europe, and there's dust there. It didn't all melt during the next winter, right? Because the atmosphere cooled down in northern latitude. It didn't all melt. And it kept going and going and going until you get about 1,000 meters or something, and then it compresses into ice, and you get continental white glaciers. So this continued, but what happened was the ocean started to cool down. The convection currents bringing, they were cooling, and over time they cooled down. The atmosphere started to clear up as the volcanoes died down, and the ice age comes basically to an end. But the glaciers start melting off, and the alpine glaciers start receding, and the continental glaciers start melting off. That particular winter, something unique happened, because the oceans got cool enough that the Arctic Ocean froze over for the first time. For the very first time. Up until then, it was too warm to freeze over. Can you imagine these animals living up there, and to the south of them is big, massive continental white glacier. To the north of them is a warm body of water that is giving them a current that kept a lot of vegetation up there, like the Gulf Stream keeps even ice, well, not absolutely east, but certainly northern Scotland, same latitude as Thompson, Manitoba, but it keeps northern Scotland more moderate. So these poor animals are blocked up there. That winter, when the atmosphere is cleared up enough, it freezes over, the great freeze. These animals have eaten, but their vegetation all dies off suddenly, frost, and they're disoriented. They can't go south, massive glacier, and the ice is in the ocean now for the first time. What happens to them? They die of hunger, malnutrition, and so on. Some of them get frozen in the tundra, and that's why we find their carcasses in mass quantities in Siberia and up in Canadian Arctic. About 700 years after it began, it came to an end. The glaciers kept melting off, and well, I don't know how far should I go. Does that help? Okay, I can go on. I have a whole 45-minute presentation on it.
Jim, maybe just mention about the references in the book of Job.
Okay, the book of Job was written around 2200 BC, and the flood occurred around 2400 BC. So 200 years after the flood, the book of Job was written. He wrote it in the midst of the Ice Age. And there are more references in the book of Job to ice and snow and sleet and everything than there is basically in the rest of the Bible combined. And not only that, it talks about the ocean being frozen. Job knew about the Ice Age, and he's writing it in the middle of the Ice Age. Now, he was farther south, and so the winters wouldn't have been severe as in the northern latitudes. Cool about the Ice Age. Interesting enough, 700 years after the flood brings us down to about the time of Joseph going into Egypt. What happened when Joseph went into Egypt? There was a famine for 7 years. Now, yes, God is directing this, so I'm not dismissing miracles here, but he could have used intermediate means, which was the end of the Ice Age, to bring about the famine. Changes, massive changes. Is there global warming? Absolutely. Is it human? No. Anthropogenic? Absolutely not. The global warming is the end of the Ice Age, and we're still experiencing it. The glaciers in the Alpine were melting off long before the Industrial Revolution, and we were pumping supposed greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide. By the way, we need carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or we won't have plants. It's that simple. And the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is 0.04%. 0.04. And the human contribution to It is like that much. It's absolutely absurd. Axe the tax.
Amen.
You know where my political views align with it. Sorry, sir. Have I given you enough on it? Yes,
Since
sir.
you're on the topic of the flood.
Pardon?
Since how you're on the topic of the flood, I recently heard that there are actually earth rocks in the surface of the moon, and some believe that that came from the flood when the waters of the deep burst forth. Do you have an opinion on that?
I've never heard that, and I'd have to look at it, because it would take a massive amount of projectiles to eject.
Well, that's what I thought too,
But it's not possible. I just have never heard that, so I have to examine the credibility of it. It sounds like a Jules Verne type of thing, you know, or maybe an Elon Musk. Did you see that? He put it up, and then they were able to land it again. And the thing that amazed me is the amount of fuel they're burning to do that. Anyway, I've never heard that. Any more? Yes, Stephen. Oh, he's got a whole book of questions.
Yeah, actually, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. If you speak that loud.
When I heard this was happening, I did decide to look into like different models of the flood for like younger creation and stuff, right? And one thing that I heard talked about was the heat problem.
The heat
problem.
problem.
If we are, so like, essentially, right, if we are to trust like stuff like radioisometric dating, which we do use like in creationism to like tell, for example, that some fossils can't have been more than.
Yeah, well, I used carbon-14 as an example in the dino presentation, didn't I? Yeah.
So the heat problem essentially is basically the note that like basically the observation that like given a lot of different radioactive materials we use to date rocks, right? If we were to, because we can date things by like seeing how much from what I understand from the layman's perspective, the half-life of different elements within materials decay, right? That's what that's what evolutionists and older creationists use to give their.
But to give their evidence, yes.
So usually I think younger creationists such as like Andrew Snelling and Larry Vardaman, the rate team, they usually like admit that like yeah, the Earth does look like if you trust like radioisometric dating, the Earth does look like it's 4.5 billion years.
Okay, I would have to, Stephen, this is a pretty technical one. I have Snelling's work, and I've read the rate, I actually have the rate report that came out. It's a massive two-tome. I'd have to go back and look at it, but I have a presentation on radiometric dating, and keeping it in layman's terms, it is silly as alchemy. I'll give you one example. Mount St. Helens exploded in 1980. They dated using radiometric dating techniques the rocks that had been produced in 1980. They dated them using radiometric techniques, something around 300,000 years old. It is absolutely a joke. But I'm not going to take the time to go into that one today. I have a complete presentation on radiometric dating, and it is just magic. It's that simple. It doesn't work. But it's way too technical, I think, for here right now. But I do have two books out there, Rocks on Clocks and one other one. If you're really interested, I recommend those two books. And I have Snelling's books in my massive library of stuff. But I got the impression from the rate studies, and I have to go back and look, and I've read them, it's pretty technical, but I got the impression that they were dismissing using radiometric dating. And Snelling in particular, he's got a tremendously good book on the flood, which I've used for some of my work. But any other questions? Yes.
I've noticed recently there have been more discoveries of what they call
Neanderthal. Oh, it's interesting.
Just wondering, like that was supposed to be helping us with kind of with a missing link between.
Yeah, but I do need to show you a slide on that.
Where did these
Permit me.
humans drive you?
I have to show you a slide on that. Because it's a very interesting, let me just go down just a minute, find it. So, what happened? Oh. Have you seen this kind of picture before? Right? This is in a science textbook called Science Focus 4, published by Pearson Educational. You've seen this kind of one before, right? From the proconsul to Australopithecus to Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthal. There's the Neanderthal, and then the Homo sapiens. So I'm going to skip through some of this. Oh, here we are. Let's deal with the Neanderthal first. 1929, Scientific American illustration showing a Neanderthal, like an ape, right? 1979, doing skull reconstructions and putting them in modern garments. You wouldn't know they were anything less than human, would you? And 2003, Neanderthal had the capacity for language and culture hitherto thought impossible in the popular science. So, Neanderthal is clearly human. What about Homo erectus? And here, new fossils and artifacts show Homo erectus crafted diverse toolkits. They're now coming to the conclusion it was human. Well, let's go the other direction. Skip here. I'm skipping through all this on Australopithecus, just I don't want to. So, the conclusion is Australopithecus is actually pygmy chimpanzee. It was basically an ape. So we're left with Homo habilis in this supposed chain. Well, here's an article. Oh, gotta skip that. Here, just a second. Go to Homo habilis, because I'm giving you the background here. Okay. Here, Homo habilis, a wastebasket taxon, little more than convenient recipient of a motley of assorted hominid fossils. More than one hominid species is represented. Paleontologists are telling you that it didn't even exist. It's just a bunch of bones that they tried to put in. This is where we are today. Does that answer your question? Every supposed human ancestor has either been delegated as an ape or a human. It's that simple. And that's not creationists that have done this. This is evolutionists that have done this.
Jim,
Yeah,
you're familiar with Lucy. Do you remember when?
it was Lucy I was
Yeah,
through.
to explain that a lot of the things that are presented to us as fact and missing links in Neanderthals are actual obvious deception and fraud. They go to those lengths to present it when Lucy was exposed as a fraud. It was not even.
Well, here's Lucy's fossil right here. And notice how they put it in the museum. You see how they put feet and hands and all that on it?
Deception.
It is deception because they have put it as if Lucy's feet were for walking upright. They have no reason to conclude that. And yet that's what they've done. Because they want it to be, right? Now, granted, in the vicinity where Lucy was found, they found human footprints. But they made a faulty conclusion. They said, well, that was Australopithecus had been walking there. They would never admit that it was actually humans walking there.
Yeah, but presented as fact to a lot of questioning people, they're led to believe that these things are there, but they're not.
Yeah.
It's
Oh, yeah. Anyway, we should probably end up here for now. But thank you for being here. And a lot of thought you need to give to this.
Yes, well, look, I know he doesn't want to clap, but who cares? I just want to re-emphasize the free website. Like, that's probably a great place for everybody to start. It doesn't cost you anything, creation.com. And, maybe you've encountered some things today that challenge your thinking. What we hoped to do today was to get us thinking about what the Bible really says, to give us some confidence. And if you have some questions, then let's keep going with those questions. Thank you so much for coming, for sticking around. Jim's going to be driving back to Toronto, so you know, it's de-evolution, he's in the best place, he's going backwards, but. I can only say that because Jim lives about a mile or maybe 2-3 miles from where Val and I live in Scotland, so it's actually a really nice place, so. I think we should pray, there's some more resources out there if you wanna take a final, skim by there, and they're available